الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآل محمد. Brothers and sisters, both present and online, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to first start off by sending my salutations to the Prophet, his holy family, his fair companions, and Imam Hussein in particular, and all those who were martyred with him, and all those who were martyred for a great cause throughout history. The discussion tonight will surround the concept that will be discussed tonight, inshallah, is the concept of submission. And it's an interesting concept because universally, with every faith that has come down, it is a central concept and a central idea. In fact, I'd go as far to argue that submission, in particular, submission accompanied with sacrifice, is the bedrock of every civilization that has ever existed. Be it the Greco-Roman tradition, who saw the sacrifice of Aeneas, the submission of Aeneas to the god in his piety towards his state, towards his family, and towards his gods. That was his sacrifice. Be it the Abrahamic tradition, where either Ishaq, according to the Jewish faith, or Ismail, according to the Muslims, was sacrificed. It became the bedrock of a civilization to come. Be it the ancient Egyptian civilization, where Osiris sacrificed himself for the cause of justice, as it was. Once again, we have this notion of sacrifice, this notion of submission. But before we continue, I'd like to pause and just analyze for a moment, take a step back and have a look at all the other religions around us. Islam's unique in the sense that it claims to be the seal of the messages, the last brick in this beautiful and immaculate house, the one that finishes it, so to speak. Before it, it claims that the Torah was revealed, and the Zabur, and the Injil. And according to our tradition, almost, or perhaps 124,000 prophets were revealed to humanity. This makes one question, that perhaps the faiths that were revealed before have a grain of truth within them. Perhaps there is something that we can learn from as Muslims. We find that the major religions of the world often have a collective term. For example, those who followed Christ today are known as Christians. They imitate him, follow in his footsteps. Those who follow Gautama Siddhartha, also known as the Buddha, are now called a Buddhist, once again, imitating a person. People collectively from the Indian subcontinent who have native beliefs are called Hindus, denoting their geography from where that spirituality came. Similarly, Judaism refers to the kingdom of Judah and the people who practice the religion within that kingdom millennia ago. The question arises, what is Islam? What does it mean to be a Muslim? Linguistically, to be a Muslim means to submit. It comes from the word taslim, to surrender. The question arises, what are we submitting? What is this fundamental thing that we need to submit? What makes a Muslim? I believe in my interpretation that this whole concept of taslim can be summed up in our testimony of faith, which we say 5 times a day in our prayers. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. It's a very interesting statement. It's somewhat paradoxical on face value. There is no God except Allah. You have to reject God before you affirm God. It's quite confusing. But on closer inspection, from one perspective, it seems as though there is no God that you perceive subjectively, but God, but an ultimate reality. Perhaps in our modern day and age, we don't have a son to sacrifice. Perhaps we don't have a Hussein who can go out in battle with 72 men into a desert and sacrifice ourselves. Perhaps the meaning of sacrifice and submission is completely different in our modern context. Perhaps it means sacrificing ideas, expectations of how the world should be, expectations of how others should interact with us. Every prophet in the Quran had something to sacrifice. We've already touched on the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Musa had a sacrifice as well. he was commanded to go forth in front of the Pharaoh. Now, based on the story of Musa, we know that Musa himself was raised by the family of the Pharaoh. He was taken in by the wife of the Pharaoh. It would be no easy task to go up and confront the people who raised you, in particular to make such a bold claim to let my people go. Yaqub had to sacrifice his Yusuf, his beautiful Yusuf. He had to submit it to Allah. And it was only in that act of submission that things grow. And we'll touch on the notion of freedom and growth later. Zakaria, his prayer in his mihrab was for his legacy, his son. It was one of the final things he asked for in his old age, where his hair was frizzy and white. Yet when he had it, he had to sacrifice it. And we know the story of Nabi Yahya alayhi salam, how he confronted King Herod of his time. So, we've touched on the notion of sacrifice and how it's universal. It's presented not only in the Quran, but also in other faiths. Perhaps we'll go into a bit more detail. The Zen Buddhist philosophy, in conjunction with Taoism as well, place a great emphasis on this notion of Wu Wei. Wu Wei, it is in Chinese. It's an interesting concept. It means action without intent, or effortless motion. The idea is that this ego that you construct in your mind, this self that you hold so dear, you submit it, you annihilate it. To the extent now that you are one and in synchronization with the universe. All of a sudden, you no longer act in accordance with what you want, you are just one with the universe. Almost like a dry leaf being blown in the wind. The traditional martial arts of Japan are quite similar, the Bushido. The code of a warrior in Japan and Korea is quite unique in the sense that, for example, martial arts such as Aikido or Hapkido. Hapki or Aiki, the Japanese rendition, are quite interesting in the sense that they mean gentle. Sometimes it means flowing, sometimes it means water. The ultimate goal of Hapkido is effortless motion. It's the idea that you train yourself so much that you get to a state where everything is cyclical. That you start from where you stopped and you stop where you start from. There is no intent, there is just action. And here for them, they believe that martial arts is more than just brawling, it's actually something divine. So once again, to reiterate, this notion of submission, this notion of attaining something higher beyond this physical world is a universal concept. It's not new to Islam, but Islam reaffirms it. It's a universal concept within all of us. The question arises then, why should we submit? What's the point of submission? Sure, I could say, yeah, I'll submit. La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadur Rasulullah. What good does that do in my life though? What good does it do in my life? How does it change my life? Does it change my life at all? It's an interesting concept to reflect on. Once again, if we break down this phrase, La ilaha. Ilaha means a God, in contrast to Allah, which some linguists say it's al plus ilah, so the God, it's specific. They call it a definitive article in front of it. Ilaha is indefinite. It's a God. In other words, it's something that can be made, something that can be constructed. Whereas Allah is an absolute form. So for example, an ilaha in the time of Nabi Ibrahim were these wooden and stone idols that people used to carve by themselves. But today, such polytheism isn't as rampant. People sort of say, they acknowledge that it's illogical, that perhaps it doesn't have meaning. Yet this concept is universal and can still be applied. Today the ilaha is a bit different. Perhaps it's our status, the way we interact with others. The ilaha could be our expectation of others, our expectation of how society should be, our expectation of where we should be in 10 years if we work for X amount of days. That is our ilaha. But when we submit that and we submit ourselves to the will of God, all of a sudden, we now accept this challenge of being pressed, being tested. But in that test, there is room for growth. See, Imam Ali alayhi salam is attributed to say a certain quote, and that is, it is not people that hurt you, but it's your expectations of them that hurt you. It's quite interesting. Once again, this subjective construction of how the world should be is what hurts you, not necessarily the objective reality. So I guess one of the benefits of submission is that you are no longer tied down by the way you think the world should be. You are free from the constraints that you have made. Almost like an anchor that pulls down a boat so the boat doesn't move. Submission is letting go of that anchor, going with the waves. Suddenly now you can traverse from point A to point B. You can go island hopping. You can go from one continent to another. You can go far and wide. But that only happens with the sacrifice of what you love most. So, practically speaking, how does this help us? Today in Australia, 1 in 7 people will suffer depression, and 1 in 4 people will suffer from anxiety. Now, depression and anxiety are a natural part of life. Everyone will experience it in one way or another. People experience it in varying degrees. Of course, there is clinical matters, and that's a bit different. But on a basic level, on the transitory depression and anxiety, most people will experience on a day-to-day basis. But I believe, personally, this is just my reflection here, that submission can help overcome such issues. Once again, anxiety is holding on to this notion of how the future should be. And depression is looking back on the past and having regret. But letting go of the future and letting go of the past and focusing on the moment, perhaps that's the way to go. Perhaps that there is being in the moment. Perhaps that is utter submission, where your will no longer applies. You're trying to execute God's command on earth. All of a sudden, what you care about no longer matters. It's what the divine plan is. I guess with this notion, we also have the ability to grow. If we don't have expectations from where we've come from or where we should go, we now have the ability to be free. Free from desires. We have room to grow as well. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So till now, we've touched upon what submission is, how it's a universal concept, and how it may benefit us. But the next question is, how do we practically implement this notion and this idea of submission? Islam is quite interesting in that it's not just a theoretical religion, it's also a practical religion. So the verse says, "Aqimus salat wa atu zakat." Right? This is quite interesting. The way I picture it visually is like a Cartesian plane. So you have the y-axis, which is almost like your ascension towards God. That is the aqimus salat. That is the process where you, as an individual, get closer to Allah. Then you have the x-axis, which is atu zakat. That is your daily interaction with your neighbor. So Allah says, if you pray and weep on your prayer mat and make your prayer mat all wet and drenched to the extent that it can't dry in the sun anymore, that's no good. That's only one piece of the puzzle. The puzzle's incomplete unless you have the second bit, and that is the daily interactions with your neighbor. On a practical level, let's take it back to when we're all at school. All of us have been there once in a while. When we were at school, how many times did we see people litter? They'd walk around the playground, perhaps chuck a little piece here, little piece there. And we see that although the school may have a good system, the school may have great teachers, if the environment is not facilitating the theory, the idea, things won't grow. So, atu zakat in that instance is to pick up the rubbish, to clean up the backyard. To clean up the backyard so that if the physical area is clean, the mental area is also clean. On a societal level, this could include things such as welfare programs. Things, for example, such as giving money to the poor, for those who are in need, assisting those who don't have means or capacity to assist their families. This is the meaning of atu zakat. We clean up our societies in order that we don't have to focus on this world, that we can focus and transcend to the next world. That way we can aqimus salat, we can establish our prayer, establish that firm connection with God. Back to the notion of submission. If we submit to Allah, if we submit and get rid of our subjective ideas of how the world should be, our expectations, all of a sudden We don't create our own purpose, we are given purpose by God. And as God mentions in the Quran, that purpose is to establish your prayer and to give in charity, which is beautiful. All of a sudden, you're not in this existential dilemma to think about your purpose anymore. That purpose is given to you. You know, there was one philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. He's an amazing read, an amazing guy overall, lived an amazing life, but he felt quite nihilistic. One of the things he couldn't deduce with pure rationalism was the notion of purpose. I mean, he concluded that there was this idea of the Übermensch and that you should transcend, but it was very subjective. And when practically applied, for example, in 1930s and the 1940s in Europe, and a lot of the fascist states took on this idea as a state notion, as a state concept, it led to disasters. Because all of a sudden, the purpose was subjective. But the way I perceive the world is a limited frame. So for example, I may have this pen right here, right? I see the pen from this angle. You see the pen from the other angle. The complete picture isn't there because we're looking at it from two different angles. So the issue with a subjective worldview is that you only see things from one angle. And I think that's the downfall, in my opinion, of states such as Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and fascist Spain, is that the states were constructed based on a subjective worldview, and thus it was limited. Whereas if we surrender that subjectivity, if we take on this objective and holistic approach to life, take on this holistic approach that God has given us, all of a sudden we are commanded not to only look at what benefits us, but benefits society as a whole. So that's that on a practical level. It's interesting though, as Muslims, we are required to do many rituals. For example, the prayer is one of them, fasting is another one, zakat is another one. These things are all very interesting because all of them entail both the spiritual aspect, which is connection with God, but also a earthly aspect to it. For example, let's look at zakat or tazkiyah as a concept in general. Tazkiyah is quite interesting in that it's a ritual purification of yourself. But in the process of purifying yourself, we also mutually benefit society. It's interesting. And from a societal perspective, if we just look at it from this lens right now, it's almost like a pile of dung. If we have a pile of dung and we hoard it tends to make this stench, a foul stench. But if we spread it, it becomes like fertilizer, which is quite beautiful. So here we have, on a societal level, things spreading, society grows. Suddenly we are not constrained by what we perceive the world to be because we have taken God's order, ordainment, and we have spread our wealth and grow society because of it. وآخر دعوانا وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.